Hello, everybody. We're just waiting to get started. We will get started, wait for people to start showing up, and then get started in just a couple of minutes. We're very excited to have you here. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. As you join us, we'll be just waiting a couple minutes, making sure as many people as possible can show up, and Zoom starts to sort of filter people in. Welcome, and we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, someone's saying they can't hear. We're checking the settings right now. It might be from your end. Wonderful, thank you for letting us know. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see familiar names coming in. We'll just wait a couple more minutes and get started. All right, welcome everybody. I imagine more will be joining along the way. Thank you so much for your patience. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع وخصوصي في رفاقنا حول العالم. Hello comrades and friends from all over the world. A special thanks to my co-organizers, Susanna on Tech, Frank and Luke, and the London Learning Cooperative, who have generously shared their platform with us. Make sure to check them out. And of course, to our wonderful panelists today, who you will soon be introduced to. I am your moderator for today. My name is Lara Shiha, or anglicized name Lara Shihai. I'm a psychoanalytic anarchist clinician, and I'm coming to you today from occupied Pamunkeyland, what is now known as Williamsburg, Virginia, in the United States. Just a word to organize us for today's webinar. Each of our phenomenal speakers today will present one angle from their own professional and lived experience, drawing out the complexities of the realities of the ways racial capitalism and imperialism show up in the clinic, and of our ethical imperative to work through the contradictions. They'll speak for a maximum of 25 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So just as a reminder throughout the Zoom webinar to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them at the end when we open it up for discussion. Also, just a reminder to everybody that this is being recorded, and you'll receive a recording if you have registered, even if you're not in attendance today. So please feel free to take breaks as needed. We know how exhausting these webinars can be, and just time yourself as you need And also the recording on YouTube allows us to close caption. Our apologies that we can't do that in real time here today. Just to start us off, a word about the mental health workers inquiry, which is the entity that has created these monthly webinars. The mental health workers inquiry is a project committed to three things. Firstly, we're about establishing a radically inclusive, internationalist, and avowedly anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist psychoanalytic practice in a way that problematizes national, racial, and class barriers. Secondly, we're developing a mechanism that brings together member-led trade union organizing with private equity to transform adjacent clinical workplaces along similar lines. Thirdly, we're aiming to create theoretical and social space in which to discuss what we're doing, what other people are doing, and how our project relates to broader questions of mental health praxis, psychoanalytic theory and practice, revolution, and the political economy of healthcare. Concretely, just to locate ourselves, we're continuing to organize these monthly events. We've also started an online reading group exploring the institutional form of revolutionary organizing, psychoanalytic theories of how groups operate, and bourgeois psychological theories relating to worker productivity and firm efficiency under capitalist class relations. If you're interested in this reading group, please drop us a line in the chat, not in the Q&A, in the chat function, and Susanna will also give you our email address and our Twitter handle so that you can follow us there. And then perhaps most excitingly of all, we're developing a business plan currently with a view to launch a psychoanalytic practice shortly. So that's a word on the mental health workers inquiry. I would like to sort of organize ourselves for today around the theme that we brought you here to discuss and take up, which is race, imperialism, and the contradictory clinic. Perhaps it comes as no surprise that this subject would be our mode of inquiry for today. What is more important is the centrality of imperialism and empire as intimately linked with the issues of race, and for our purpose, extending into the clinic. In their article, Border Imperialism, Racial Capitalism, and Geographies of Deracination, Levi, Gahman, and Elise Hjalmarson say, the creation of race and subsequent production of racial subjects offers the imperialist imagination a convenient justification and serviceable pretext to dispossess and enslave, to plunder and exterminate, acts taught to be in some far distant past and oft-thought to reside only in history, yet that continue to shatter communities and alienate individuals to this day, end quote. And I'll put that in the chat for everybody to see as well. When we conceptualize it this way, this issue of race and imperialism, which not coincidentally might also be the way that Fanon conceptualized it for us way before this moment, analysis and issues of race become constitutive of the ideological premise of our theories and practice, even if in omission. That is, the ways in which they were built, our theories and our practice, purposefully to shore up and centralize certain modes of thinking and being in line with white supremacy and the capitalist imperial order that would have us believe in binaries of East and West, central and periphery knowledge, normativity of race, gender, sexuality, ability, class, and of course, all that this displaces by design. Our question today then, in my mind, cannot exist without us, especially clinicians, contending with the violence done in the name of the state and inculcated into our practice and into thoughts about health and wellness as well as our labor. In the context of the United States, I'm thinking about the countless Black siblings who've been murdered. Just yesterday, a grand jury absolving officers 6 months after the brutal killing of Breonna Taylor in her own home. Of the Micmac fishermen whose rights continue to be violently wrenched by the settler state and their proxy commercial fishermen. Of Indigenous sisters regularly being stolen and disappeared, of Palestinian homes being demolished in occupied Palestine, of normalization efforts by one settler state for another settler state in support of regional destabilization in what they call the Middle East, of refugees made so from an imperial project trying to make it to shores against the backdrop of BBC camera people narrating their struggle without offering aid, of countless Indigenous, Black, and Brown people left to die in poverty, suffer evictions, and the continued wrecking effects of COVID-19 without access to healthcare the world over. The question for me then, through my rage, through the ever-encroaching stench of fascism, is how we imagine a mental health inquiry without these questions. I'm hopeful that today will help us collectively sort through some of these layers, and I'm personally so excited to be joined by our panelists today. So without further delay, I will turn it over to our first panelist, Feluke Taylor. Feluke is a psychotherapist and writer. She works with and teaches creative writing as a relational, psychopolitical, therapeutic practice and gravitates towards where therapy, art, and activism converge. Her practice grounded in a Black feminist praxis that is supported by various transdisciplinary collaborations. To you, Feluke.
Thank you, Lara, for that. And your, wow, what context you set. I'm still with all the things you said, and I'm thinking about that it's happening so quickly, that some of the things you mentioned happened today and yesterday and the day before, and it sometimes feels like I can't kind of keep up with it. So thank you for setting the context. I am going to talk about, well, originally the title you sent me was Race, Imperialism and Another Clinic, and now it's the Contradictory Clinic. So I liked Another Clinic and a Contradictory Clinic. But I'm going to talk about moving clinics, or moving. And writing is the way that I find out what I think often, and find out what I feel and what's going on and what needs to come through me. So I'm going to read what I've written, but also talk a little bit. But I'm going to start with somebody else's writing, and that's a writer, poet and lawyer, Norbese Philip, born in Tobago, living in Canada, African diasporan. And I'm going to use her essay as a kind of springboard here. It's called Caravana, African Roots and Continuities. And in another place, it's called Race, Space and the Poetics of Moving. And she introduces us to two characters, Totoben and Maisie. And they are, when we meet them, taking part in Caravana, which is a carnival in Toronto. And then we move back and we find them on the slave ships, traveling from West Africa to the New World. And then we meet them again in the New World, enslaved, forced labor on plantations, and then after so-called emancipation. But what she does really beautifully is show us through Carnival, in its many incarnations throughout the African diaspora. She talks about Toronto, Notting Hill, New York, Port of Spain. She shows us Totoben and Maisie's moving, and how people try to stop their moving and how they keep moving. So this is where I'm starting to think about race, imperialism, and the other clinic. And I'm going to start by just reading a few lines, just the very beginning of this essay. Sweat and jostle and push, jostle and jostle, push and jostle and shove and move to the pulse, riddim pan, riddim and beat the beat, sweat like a ram goat, sweat for so. So decolonizing, Decolonizing Methodologies, a book by Linda Tuai Smith. She identifies three concepts that are fundamental, she says, to the spatial vocabulary of colonialism: the line, the center, and the outside. And maybe reading Sweat and jostle and push is crossing a line when I'm here to talk about race, imperialism, and a clinic. Why am I doing Carnival? Maybe because Carnival is inextricably bound up with race and imperialism, but while also at the same time disturbing and disrupting their logics and relations. Also because the line, center, and outside are such deeply embedded ideas that it's hard to reimagine a clinic outside of them, or at least for me, without some kind of creative springboard, especially at this time you know, the Prime Minister in this country says this is a tipping point, but I feel like I'm constantly tipping, and there's always the threat of despair. So I try to think of tipping as crossroads. Again, Norbesi Phillips writing this essay is about crossroads, and she describes them as where the world of the living bucking up the world of the spirit. So either way, Maisie and Totoben had and have a lot to despair about, and they kept and they keep moving and crossing. And that's the energy I'm bringing to this, to talk about. Let's start with race. Racism, all about stopping or controlling our moving. Race is fundamental to imperialism because it's a technology for imperialism. It's a way of gaining and extending power. And lines, the line has been key, drawing lines which categorize the human and the world, divided according to imagined hierarchies of value. In these hierarchies of value, man, capital M, is at the top, European man who becomes white man is the real human, and everything else, thing else exists in the hierarchy in relation to him. And I say everything because at the bottom we have non-human, what's considered the non-human animals, the earth, nature, which is a thing to be extracted, used, exploited. But occupying the space between man and the non-human are the others, who, because they're not white, are considered less than human, closer to animals, earth, and therefore to things, so also available for exploitation and extraction. And as slavery showed us, considered not to enjoy human rights, such as the right to their own bodies, or to own or be in relationship with their children. And as to think about this breaking of family and kinship bonds for a minute, and what a serious stop to movement that is. I mean, we sometimes conceptualize trauma as an interrupted movement, something that couldn't be completed, thwarted. Think about the kind of trauma enacted when we're blocked from making those basic moves towards each other as family. They tried to stop the moving, but it doesn't stop the moving. Totoben and Maisie sweat and jostle and push, practice kinship, practice family anyway, make family in other ways and otherwise. They move in and around, and in spite of the attempts to stop them, in spite of the enclosures, in spite of the physical and psychic terror. And if we remember this and respect it, discussions around the Black family as dysfunctional end here. Be astonished instead that anything that can be called the Black family exists, has survived, and is still moving, and then we learn from it. Now, when I was 16 years old and homeless and multi-level messed up, a social worker suggested therapy. And I went along to this free clinic because I guess I wanted to know what was stopping my moving, what was getting in the way of me living peacefully and pleasurably. And I was disappointed. I'm not going to go into that story. But in summary, I didn't like or understand the way she was moving, the therapist. And also it didn't seem that she got the way that I was moving. So maybe I trained as a therapist because I thought my moves were better. Anyway, now I'm more interested in the moves we make together, how we read and respond to each other in our consulting spaces. I think most therapists and clinics do want to support people to move, not to be blocked by depression or constrained by anxiety or trapped in cycles of addiction. We value movement and we do try to use it in our work. And I think of some of the terms we use, psychodynamics, transference, countertransference, they all suggest an interest in movement. But the contradiction is that we're challenged by our own tendencies towards fixedness. Perhaps the idea of progress, this need to develop models and schools and institutions, which it could itself be thought to be imperial in a way, means there is an inevitable pull towards form and solidity. Also, in the context of race and imperialism, clinics and to some extent therapists have certain kinds of moving in mind. For example, a lot of therapy in this country is provided via employers, employee assistance programs, schools, health services. Funding must be secured, which means outcomes must be measured. Certain kinds of moving can be measured as success. Can this person move in a way that allows them to work? Can they move in a way that fits within the school system? Have we helped them to stop moving in ways that question, challenge, or kick against the environments that they're in? These are some of the measures of success. And I've worked in some of these environments and I feel the tension of these messages because they are contradictory. Yes, we want to support your moving, but only if you move within the logics of the existing structure, which by its very nature actually needs to control and stop your moving. And trying to stop the moving doesn't stop the moving. Look at school exclusion rates and you will see Toto Benamesi feeling how school is oppressive, seeing how the curriculum erases their history, how it barely registers their existence except as a problem, how it offers nothing that can help them make sense of their worlds. See them, Toto Benamesi, finding ways to move around this dry curriculum and around the teachers whose job it is to stop them moving. See them in school making noise, moving anyway, crossing lines, being sent to the outside, moving still with all the labels, oppositional, defiant, disruptive, disordered. The form of imperialism that we know as colonialism had made its own moves and crossings. It needed to move people en masse, slavery, indentured labor. But now, economic imperialism needs money to move and people to stop. Arundhati Roy says, the freer global capital becomes, the harder national borders become. Now we know a lot of resources are invested in stopping people moving, to stop them crossing the lines that we know as national borders. And like Toto Benamesi, people move anyway. They make all kinds of crossings across oceans, seas, deserts. They keep moving, and we keep being told that the movers are the problem, a refugee problem, an immigrant problem. But Toto Benamesi are not the problem, have never been. They have been put in a problem. The way they move is the response to the problem. It's a way of being in relationship with the problem. People try to stop your moving by drawing maps and making laws, and they insist that they alone are the map makers and the law makers. They have the technology for that. Then you make maps with what you have, your bodies, you're moving. And you move the problem with your moving. Movement, in this case, migration, is told to us as if it's a death drive. Why are these people risking their lives in small boats? What about the threats to the security of our nation? But surely it would be more accurately described as a life drive, as eros, in fact, as love. Now, racism and imperialism twist us up, encourage us to see death as life and life as death, misrecognize the problem. So for our clinic to be helpful, it needs both to recognize problems and express those problems in terms that are recognizable to the people who have use for the clinic. Psychoanalytic ideas are not the easiest to express or recognize in relation to everyday living, but some of what I do like about psychoanalytic ideas is the ability to theorize hate. Hate affects our everyday. Fascism, white supremacist ideology. And I think many people recognize to some extent the role that splitting and projection play in the production and maintenance of race and racism. And yet, I've yet to come across a training curriculum on which this is really explored in the depth that I think is due. In teaching about trauma, my colleagues and I do try to challenge the narrow understanding of trauma as a one-time unexpected event with a broader definition that takes account of the experience of living in hate. Psychotherapist Sean Ricks, in a paper called Normalized Chaos, Black Feminism, Womanism, and the Redefinition of Trauma, says that this includes fighting every day to have your voice heard, fighting for your children to ensure their psychological development. Trauma is putting on the mask and cape before you walk out of the door and hoping that no one sees your tears or your fears. For if they smell weakness, they will pounce. She's talking about the experience of Black women, and we know this because we live it, but I hope even if it is not your lived experience, you can see, by which I mean be willing to see, the trauma of race. Race, even though imagined, projected, has become entirely embedded in ways that make it real. It's real, has real effects, embodied effects in actual bodies. I am a racialized body. Resmaa Menakem says some useful things in My Grandmother's Hands about embodied racial trauma. Race has become matter, and it's come to matter because it's life and death, life chances and death chances. So we cannot keep insisting on conceptualizing race as if it's a discrete aspect of life, or worse, of biology, and teaching it as this kind of concept. It is not modular. It's not a module. The lines that attempt to enclose it don't work. The attempts to position it outside so as not have to trouble the center don't work. Race is a total experience, and it crosses everything everywhere. It's already crossing the curriculum. It's there in every seminar and training group waiting to be spoken. And when we don't speak it, its crossings become ghostly. So whatever progress we think we've made, race continues to trouble training spaces, and it haunts in the way that Avery Gordon describes haunting as a thing to be done. So not haunting for the purpose of scaring or terrorizing anyone. And I know that when race comes up, some people experience it like that, as an affront and attack. But actually, it's always there, haunting us, because there is something that needs doing or undoing. Whiteness needs some undoing. I said whiteness, not white people. I'm not advocating undoing people, only being informed by many people who spent time studying this and have concluded that there is a need to unsuture or divest. Unsuture is George Yancey's word, whiteness. We've become familiar with the term white fragility, but white frigidity, and these are the words of my colleague Robert Downs, rigidity captures something about the affect, I think. Encountering whiteness often feels rigid, like entering a space in which movement cannot happen, a refusal to move, to think. How to get whiteness to move when it sees itself as fixed and settled, and when it is the thing that has forgotten it made itself? And these are questions for our clinic, but they're not ones I'm going to address now. But what I do want to say is something about safety, about how whiteness has made itself as a signifier of safety, safety, success, supremacy, by making blackness a signifier of danger, disorder, disaster, and death. The quote by Hannah Black talking about whiteness as the poorly upheld dream that safety is real. I think that's worth hanging out with. And Christina Sharp in The Wake talks about the dysgraphia of disaster, how we seem unable to speak about or represent, particularly in the media, blackness as anything except disaster. That's what it is. And I know Andrew Samuels on one of your previous panels made some important points about safety. And how therapists collude with this idea of safety as real by offering safe spaces. And I suppose I want to add to that voice and disturb the idea of safety as a noun, as a thing, and make it move. Move with Tota Bene-Maisie again, as they move through unsafe spaces, as they always have, and show us safety as a practice, practicing safety on the move. Now, disciplinary crossings. Academic knowledges are organized around the idea of disciplines and fields of knowledge, and they're all grounded in cultural worldviews. And these disciplinary arrangements, maybe they make some things easier, but they also make a lot of things really hard to say or express, hard to fit or place. They disturb or block our moving, and it shows up in different ways. You might be told that the knowledges that structure your life are superstition or mumbo jumbo. Your knowledge doesn't fit there, is discredited, is not valid. If you're working as a therapist, people might ask you where you trained. Curiosity, maybe, but too often a question of validity and status. You are being asked to locate yourself within a discipline that has its own hierarchies. Now, this is where I get imposter syndrome. It creeps in when I'm asked to locate myself within geographies that I didn't make, that were constructed in and with my absence, that are based on my erasure and don't have any concern for what I know or how I live. And I find, again, Christina Sharp's idea of undiscipline useful. It animates me. It supports my moving by turning down the volume, if you like, on lines, fading the lines. Practice undiscipline, she says, so that I'm free to cross When I'm practicing discipline, I'm free to cross, and moving can happen, and I can move between clinic and carnival and crossroads and therapist. I can push and shove and jostle and shove and move and whine. And that brings me to language. Now, Nobesse Philip writes this essay in what she calls the Caribbean demotic, the vernacular, that she actually moves between. And she talks about the strength and beauty of that lying in its kinetic qualities, its kinopoiesis. It's a language that moves, and it makes us move. And she's one of many people writing and speaking on the problem of words for people of the African diaspora or the Black Atlantic. We use colonizer languages, English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, in which Blackness's non-being is embedded. So to attempt to do healing work in these languages is problematic. But it is a problem that we have, because for many of us, this is all we have. As poet Dion Brown says, the language we use already contains our demise, which is partly why I work with creative writing, because it does allow moving. Words can be turned, broken up, refixed, remixed, blended, and it helps to temper some of the more imperially flavored words that we work with: psychotherapist, analyst, patient, client, clinic. When I hear clinic, I think line, center, outside. I think about what a space called clinic looks like, about what fits and doesn't fit within its boundaries. Certain language and movement don't fit, it seems. Nobesse introduces this essay by explaining her use of patois. She understands that she's entering the space of the academic essay, that the way that this language fits here will be questioned, so she explains it beautifully, of course. This is why I'm moving this way. But when we have to explain why we are moving in the way we are moving, it interrupts the moving. To explain my moving is long, is extra time and extra labor. So another question for our clinic, I think, is in what ways are we therapists putting the burden of the crossings on those who consult us? How are we facilitating processes of crossing? What moving and crossing are we doing? What moving capacities might we develop to be moving therapists, moving language, moving disciplines, moving curriculums, and moving clinics? So before I end, I need to make some shout outs to my collaborators and friends and conspirators who are out there moving and generating in some of the ways that I'm describing. I've been in some fabulous collaborations over the past few years that have moved me and made me move and supported my moving. So therapeutic relations and some of the knowledges that we most traditionally associate with clinic and consulting room have been able to show up in different spaces: performance spaces, storytelling spaces, writing spaces, neighborhood spaces, and spaces of Black study, which Fred Moten tells us exist anywhere that Black people gather. So there are too many gatherings and gatherers to mention them all by name, but Barbie Asante, generative community building artist and creator of the Declaration of Independence project, you and all the women all over the world involved in this project, I'm delighted to be a collaborator. Omikemi, Waymaker, body therapist, for the collaboration that supported the Dub Rights program. Gail Lewis, Dr. Gail Lewis, let me give you your time. Dr. Gail Lewis, who's always throwing fantastic text and resources into the mix, and who introduced me to Nobesse's Caribana essay, this essay. Robert Downs, working out there to decommission whiteness and complicate the white therapist, and on the development of our small corner curriculum. And to my partner, Hakeem, AKA Teacher, for the love that he pours into the roots, dub, jazz, poetry, mindfulness mix every week on Trust Me Radio, and the Dare to Rest, Resist spaces that he has co-created with Ayana Salim in support of Black wellness. These are all spaces that work, in my opinion, Sylvia Winter's idea of human being as praxis rather than biology. Not Homo sapiens, she says, not the ones who know, but Homo narrans, the ones who tell ourselves that we know. In other words, we who are making ourselves with the stories we tell. Still here? I hope you are, whoever you are, and I don't want you to think that I underestimate the challenge of moving your moving in this racist, imperialist world. I would recommend Joyful Militancy, Building Resistance in Toxic Times. because out of this and the discussions I've had with a friend around this, we kind of got to this concept of empire mind. Now, empire in this book is defined as a complex set of processes that separate people from their power, their creativity, and their ability to connect with each other and their worlds. So empire mind, as I'm thinking of it, is the gathering of psychological processes that enacts this separation. And it separates me from my own capacities and stops my moving. And it could have stopped me being here speaking now. Why? Well, because empire mind doesn't think I should be here, honestly. I'm a child of empire. I've been fed with a particular set of ideas and images about who knows and who doesn't, and who should take up space and who shouldn't, and who is worth listening to, and who has validity. I'm a Black woman. At 6 weeks old, I was in care. I grew up on the estate in social housing. I left school at 16. I got thrown out of college after a few months because I spent more time playing cards in the refectory than in class. I didn't go to university. I have 5 children. Empire mind calculates all of this and wants to know, who do I think I am? And asks me frequently. It basically considers me unauthorized. And I don't want you to mistake this for a rags to riches story. I'm not going to do Jay-Z and start talking about how Black people just need to pull themselves up and become billionaires, or even Michelle Obama and, you know, education is the key to a prosperous future. Although empire mind loves those stories. Individuals making it against the grain, you know, getting rich and getting to the top. But no, that's not this story. This is Toto Ben and Maisie, remember, who keep their moving, even when people look down on it, devalue it, call it uncivilized or not respectable, mumbo jumbo, not hard science, when they try to fence it in or push it out, when they try to say it doesn't belong, that this is not a proper discipline, or they ask where it is in the literature and demand references and citations, and ask on whose authority these moves are being made. This is a story about the self-authorization required for unauthorized moves. Authorizing ourselves to move with the knowledges we have, applied and delivered in the ways that sit well in us, in our bodies, undisciplined, if you like. So that's why I'm here talking about clinics that move and moving clinics and therapeutic practice that doesn't necessarily follow a line, but is a way of being curious about all of our occupations and colonized states. Therapeutic practice that can challenge racism and imperialism. Therapeutic practice as moving experiments in reconnection, reconnecting with our creativity and power and with our own and each other's worlds. Moving as praxis, practicing freedom in unfreedom and practicing safety in unsafety. And like Toto Ben and Maisie, we are going to have to sweat and jostle and push and shove and make some noise and keep moving our moving. Thank you.
Whew, Sister Fulike, I mean, talk about being moved. I'm so moved to be in community with you here and to hear your words and your affect. That's what's sticking to me. In the spirit of just trying to organize that in full, and in allowing Sohail to gather himself and anybody else who needs some space also to process and sit with what we've just heard. I just want to sort of offer back some thoughts, not to necessarily be answered now, but for us to sit with and then maybe take up and hear. There's 3 things that I highlighted, as you said, from the richness of that, and that I can land on 3 things is amazing in and of itself. But you said trauma from stopping, the trauma that comes from stopping basic movement toward each other. And of course, that's making me think of the politics of space, of freedom, both literally, but also politically, right? In essence, within structure, how structures are built, to the politics of foreclosure that comes with issues of migration, under apartheid, as in Palestine, as was in South Africa, in our clinical spaces, and in this time of COVID right now. So this idea of movement, the trauma of not moving towards each other, feels so important. On fixedness as representative of normativity of foreclosed possibility. Everything is already is, right? No possibilities beyond the structures that encapsulate us, which is a function of coloniality, and fixedness is shoring up the status quo, right? That only benefits white supremacy, imperialist racism, and the structures that, again, enclose us. And then the final thing that I'll say before I turn it over to Suhaid, people move anyway. I mean, that statement, people move anyway, even under fear. And so having me wonder, how do we articulate an ethical imperative for this liberatory potential? Because that statement has so much liberatory potential anyway, move anyway, right? Versus being agents against movement or reinscribing the trauma, but also the limitations that sell themselves as natural, that we become part of this naturalized state of non-movement. I'm excited to talk more about that. So hey, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me just read a little bit about who Suhaid Janasari is, researching the effects of the asylum process on mental health at King's College London. He has spent the last 7 years working on different projects around migration and migrant rights, including starting the Migrant Connections Festival, the Walk and Talk Migrant Welcome Tours, and the anti-colonial group Speaking Statues. He has delivered trainings and talks on the asylum process and written a report on free movement for global justice now. Suhaid, over to you.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me. Wow, that's a pretty tough act to follow. That was really incredible, and still kind of thinking about what Fuluke said. But yeah, so thank you so much for having me, and I'm really appreciative to be part of this sort of fantastic discussion and group speakers. So I was asked to talk about sort of intersections between migration, mental health, and colonialism. So so I'm going to talk about how mental health has been historically defined, and how these definitions can lend themselves to the persecution of migrants, marginalization of minorities, and discrimination against Black and brown people. This will lead on to a short bit about how NGOs can pathologize and depoliticize sanctuary seekers using mental health labels. And I'll end with a little bit on the sort of dominance of Western mental health terms, knowledge, and how colonialism underlies all of these discussions. And I will briefly refer to very basic post-colonial theory at various points in the talk. But the fundamental question underlying what I hope to say is how do we decolonize mental health? How do we decolonize migration and mental health practice and research? So I'm also coming from a bit of a research perspective, being a researcher. So defining mental health. So mental disorder is defined in contrast to what society considers normal. So this, of course, differs across time and culture. So there's a really good paper from Estrada and Restrepo Ochoa, and they do a sort of historical analysis of how normal has been defined, and hence how mental health has been defined. And they arrive at 4 concepts which have consistently defined normality. So their maladjustment, does someone accept society's common rules and social standards? Do they work, produce, and relate to each other according to society's social rules? There's a biomedical definition of normality. Is someone not normal because they have a disease which can objectively, physically be defined, diagnosed, and treated? There's a statistical definition of normality. Is a certain behavior very unusual? Is it outside the natural variation you'd expect to see? Does it occur at a time and place that such behaviors usually don't occur? There's And then you've got sort of self-described normality, welfare, and well-being. So you've got a so do you feel good, basically? And so you've got the hedonic side of that, you know, the sort of pleasure-seeking side of that, and you've got the eudaimonic side of that, which is around self-fulfillment and actualization. And basically, so these definitions of normality, and hence what is mental health, have been used at certain points throughout history and have been weaponized to suppress and pathologize dissent. So, you know, social revolutionaries or marginalized groups, such as migrants or people seeking sanctuary or asylum, they might be particularly susceptible to being labeled as abnormal and then consequently persecuted. So, you know, a famous example of this would be the psychologist Cartwright. In 1851, he argued that slave laborers who ran away in search of freedom suffered from a mental disorder. He called this drapetomia. And he also said that slaves who attempted to avoid the work they were forced to do suffered from another mental disorder. It doesn't matter what it's called, diaspia, whatever. But basically, this is a clear example of the sort of violent misuse of the maladjustment definition, and it's also, you know, a suggestion that these definitions, maybe there is no real good way to use them. Maybe they are inherently violent. You know, a more modern example is from the Muslim Uyghurs in China. They've been forcibly detained by authorities, tortured, killed. People have been sent to sort of prison camps because of, and I quote, manifestations of Muslim identity, end quote, such as growing a beard. Sources say that people are being forced to renounce Islam, eat pork, drink alcohol. The Chinese government has framed Islam as a ideological illness, and has called the detentions of the prisons hospitals. In this way, belief in Islam is characterized as a mental illness, and it justifies the Chinese government's persecution as a medical intervention. As they are a religious and ethnic minority, the government may also be defining Uyghur behavior as statistically abnormal and hence mentally ill. So again, there's another way normality and mental health has been defined, and in a very violent way. Uyghurs obviously constitute a minority of the Chinese population, 1%, which is obviously still significant. So yeah, and then I guess this links into ideas, well, it links into Fanon's ideas around colonial oppression. So one of the things he argued is that the French colonialists in Algeria frequently used mental health to mute and dismiss colonial resistance and further subjugate Algerians. So French psychiatrists argued that Algerians had a mental disability. They were obstinate, lacked emotion, they were puerile, they were prone to unnecessary extreme reactions. They said that they were incapable of seeing the bigger picture, and they were primitive and instinctive. So some of these colonial stereotypes are enforced through and created through this sort of mental health language. And this French psychiatrists argued that depressed Algerians killed the French because they couldn't kill themselves, because they had little understanding of themselves. They had an underdeveloped moral conscience. They had an underdeveloped sense of self, so they couldn't possibly think of killing themselves because they couldn't see themselves. So, sort of a really scary way mental health can and has and is being used into violent ends against marginalized communities. So now I'm just going to link it in with the pathologization of sanctuary seekers by international NGOs. So international NGOs can also use mental health language to marginalize sanctuary seekers, refugees, migrants, take the idea of trauma and being traumatized, a concept often associated with refugees. Trauma is an exceptionally broad catch-all category encompassing experiences from amputation, sexual assault, abduction, losing homes. It's endless. And the idea that people are traumatized can detract from their resilience, their active engagement with their situation, for instance, in the act of migration, and their problem solving around a really difficult situation they find themselves in, and also their demands for change. It can remove people's agency and depoliticize them. And someone who is depoliticized is marginalized and lacks rights. So what do international NGOs gain by pathologizing and depoliticizing people? So firstly, evidencing high rates of mental disorder can help mobilize international resources like government funding. You know, if you say 70% of refugee population have PTSD, you can fund that, I guess. Equally, recognizing and embracing people as political beings might cause difficulties obtaining funding. For instance, probably putting off more liberal donors. It's not just NGOs, by the way, who have an incentive to pathologize. The whole system is set up for this. So, you know, people who apply for asylum, their lawyers use legal reports as a basis for the applications, or at least as evidence to support the application. So legal reports, you know, someone will go to a lawyer and they'll say, yeah, this person is very depressed or has these mental health conditions, and it's links to their case. And lawyers can also use mental health reasons to stop deportations and transfers under the Dublin regulations. So the whole system is partly set up to pathologize. More than funding, however, depoliticization and pathologization creates meanings for NGOs. So Malkai argued that charities need to mold refugees into exemplary victims. So that is, I quote, a victim whose judgment and reason has been compromised by his or her experiences. So exemplary victims help charities justify what they do and why they are doing it. They are victims so helpless that they can only be supported by a charity's trained professionals. Their mental disorder is such that they either can't speak for themselves, or they can't be relied on to provide an accurate account of their own experiences. So this is the white savior mentality. This is the white man's burden manifest. So I've gone over definition of normality, how mental health is used, and mental health labels can be used very violently, linked it in with how NGOs use mental health labels around migrants and refugees. So now coming to the dominance of Western knowledge in, at least in my field of migration and mental health. So the frequent use, for instance, of post-traumatic stress disorder with the sanctuary seekers not only illustrates the pathologization, but it also illustrates the dominance of Western frameworks of mental health and the dominance of Western knowledge. And by the way, I'm defining Western as high-income, majority white nations. So PTSD, for example, was initially developed, a mental illness label and symptomology developed for US Army veterans from the Vietnam War. In the words of Summerfield, I quote, PTSD offered Vietnam veterans legitimated victimhood, moral exculpation, and a disability pension through a doctor-attested sick role, end quote. It wasn't designed for sanctuary seekers. It wasn't designed for the thousands of different types of people claiming asylum and trying to find a better life. In a recent review we did, we found that, we did a review on asylum and mental health, and we found that 90% of studies measured PTSD, and they found the average rate of PTSD to be 40%, which is incredibly high. It's almost 1 in every 2 migrants they worked with. So, and even perhaps in more, arguably more universal mental health concepts such as depression and anxiety problems persist. This is because researchers and clinicians still rely on mental health measures developed in the West. And of course, non-Western concepts of mental health, perhaps around spiritual well-being, are often dismissed as non-scientific. This is part of the reason why research in non-Western settings we found was pretty much completely ignored, even though the majority of the countries which really host people who have fled their homes are not in the West. So the dominance of Western mental health knowledge and discourse can be seen as a colonial byproduct, a continuation of white supremacy. Discourse is a way of thinking, producing ideas, speaking and behaving. It defines who and who's reasonable and what is true, who may speak, and what people can speak about. So the discourse of Western mental health knowledge is it's a way of defining knowledge. It's an exercise of power produced by a dominant social order, and it reflects institutional oppressions. So Spivak talks about how Western discourse and knowledge around science can be used as part of a civilizing mission and a way of silencing people who are oppressed. It could also be argued for the rise of uncredited, decontextualized treatments rooted in non-Western settings, such as mindfulness, continues a tradition of colonial appropriation of knowledge. So this links into debates around Orientalism, the condescending, exoticizing, and colonial lens through which scholars in the West can view other cultures. And so the work of Said is obviously important here. And he describes transcultural psychiatry as a discipline born in Europe and used by white psychiatrists and anthropologists to describe the exotic and often patronizing observations that they saw as novel and bizarre in non-white people and cultures across the world. So kind of to start wrapping it up, so we've talked about definitions of normality, violence and mental health labels. We talked about the misuse and the pathologization of mental health labels and the resulting pathologization from NGOs and international NGOs, and then link that to the dominance of Western knowledge. And so I think throughout this, the colonial imprint on migration and mental health is clear. Guess what is to be done? I'm really still thinking through the answers to this, and it's something hopefully we can delve into in the discussions. But I'll suggest a couple of very tentative small ways forward as an academic. So in terms of trying to break down some of our conceptions or strand the Western dominance of mental health labels, terms, and measures, there was interesting work done by Miller and colleagues where they had a more collaborative way of looking at migration and mental health. So they developed a checklist for distress with Afghan academics and community members. It's called the Afghan Symptom Checklist. And the scale was partly developed through common elements in community narratives of well-being. And it could be replicated in the diaspora communities. It could be a small way of decentering Western concepts of mental health. I've also written a paper arguing that we should use the term sanctuary seeker in migration and mental health research. So it's more of an academic point, but This is defined as people who have fled their country and are asking another country for safety and residence. It contrasts with labels such as asylum seeker, refugee, illegal immigrant, regular migrant, unaccompanied asylum-seeking minor. These are all fragmentary terms that reflect UK government discourse. They're designed to divide people. They don't actually reflect people's experiences. For example, two asylum seekers in the same country can have totally different experiences based on their nationality, age, and education. The term sanctuary seeker aims to connect more with people's lived experience, making groups based on the difficulty of obtaining status, of how supportive post-migration conditions are for integration, trying to see people through their experience, I guess. So it's I guess the answer to the initial question I put about how do we decolonize mental health and migration practice and research, it's probably a very long road, and hopefully there are some ideas in this talk and it's got some people thinking about ways forward. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that was vaguely interesting.
Thank you so much, Suhail. Much appreciated. So again, in response to your talk, and then in between your talk and Annie Lee prepping to begin, let me just sort of offer some organizing thoughts and kind of where I see a connection between what you're saying, what Fulike was saying also about these things that are, they're happening today. I think that's what Fulike, you started out by saying, this is happening today. This is like some of the things that I said to organize us are things of today that reach into the past, but also are our present, right? That they're not so far off. They don't just live in the past. And I think you said the same thing, Suhail, in some ways, that this idea, these sort of Eurocentric ideas, or the ways in which people are marginalized in our healthcare industry in many ways is still present, perhaps not so blatant as some of these terms that people used to use, these blatantly eugenicist terms or white supremacist terms, but our curriculum still very much supports imperialist dictates about health and wellness, right? About what we understand to be health and wellness. We talk, particularly in psychoanalysis, about primitive functioning, about primitive defenses, about better defense, about second order defenses. And then, of course, there's all these sort of manualized treatments or ideas of how to approach marginalized folks, right? Even in our textbooks and what we choose to teach, and how we tell our students, for these types of people, you do this. For these types of people, look out for this. These are ways in which this shows up still today. And I also thought that you're drawing out, in some ways, where you're highlighting are the conditions that exist and continue to exist, where we're then in a position where the only way to get funding means you have to defang and depoliticize people's realities and fundamental being, right? Morphing them into this rigidified, again, going back to this rigidness piece of perfect victims, right? That are helped through the magnanimity, of course, of our field that's somehow positioned to do so in such an incredibly, accurate way that perhaps indigenous knowledge can't do, or people producing their own ways of being can't do. And so it's also a matter of who gets to show up. And this is the sort of the theme that I'm seeing. Who gets to show up, who gets to speak to these things, whose knowledge is central, what is periphery, and what are the parameters within which people have to exist even to access basic care, to fulfill the sort of dignity of being human, of the permission of movement. What are the roles that people are invited into? And in some ways we can think about it invited into co-optation by state, by imperial powers, to become certain modes of being that then can be taken care of, right? That then deserve care or access. So again, really, thank you so much for joining us in this. And then I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful friend and sister, Annie Lee Jones. I'm just going to read a little bit about Annie Lee before she takes the stage or the screen. Dr. Annie Lee Jones is a clinical psychologist at the New York Harbor Department of Veterans Affairs Community Living Center and a psychoanalyst in private practice in Queens, New York. Dr. Jones is faculty and co-chair of the Ethnicity, Race, Culture, Class, and Language Committee at New York University postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, where she completed her psychoanalytic training. She's also faculty member at Adelphi University, the Stephen Mitchell Center for Relational Studies, and is a fellow and training analyst at the Institute for Psychoanalytic Training and Research, IPTAR. She's taught courses at the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy in New York City. Dr. Jones is a founding member of Black Psychoanalysts Speak. I'm sure many of you have watched the wonderful documentary that they produced. Dr. Jones is a graduate of the Clinical Psychology Program, University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Her research interests include the study of classical texts on the origin of constructs related to the unconscious, the intrapsychic lives of Black American men and women, and the economics of racialized internal processes, particularly the racialized third in sociopolitical encounters and the clinical writings of Fanon. She's presented papers at the Freud Museum and several other venues. Annie Lee, go for it. Let's unmute you first. There we go. Wait, there.
It's done.
Yes.
I am honored. I am overwhelmed, and I'm honored to be on this panel. I want to start, before I start with my paper, I want to say that COVID-19 and the pandemics that are raging through the streets of New York and in other major cities is overwhelming. It is real, it's serious. I, as an older Black woman with some other comorbidities, according to the researchers, am in danger in this urban area. Queens is a dangerous place for an older Black woman to be. I have never been so conscious of my physicalness as I have since March to now. And I really want to thank the panelists for allowing me to anchor some of my thinking to your thinking, because this is a very new place for me. I'm often invited to speak because I'm visibly Black and I have those credentials from credentialing sites. But nothing has been like the experiences I've had over the last 3 months. And I also want to thank Lara for giving me the chance to write a paper that has been burning a hole in my soul for over 45 years. So to that, I want to just go to my paper, and then after that, hopefully we can think about what I'm intending here. This is a paper I'm in the process of rewriting. I've been thinking about it for a long time. And it has to do with the sense of self and the sense of seeing yourself being seen and experiencing this as an internal state, often loaded with all the things that I said at the beginning here, but I've never, my analytical skills, my training, and my readings, nothing prepared me for what I am experiencing on a daily basis in this city. It's real. Black women are in danger in urban America. All those deaths, all those cases, if they would only break them down by location and by color and age, you'd see what I'm seeing around me every day. And the sound of an ambulance. So if you hear ambulances screaming by, it's because my area is still alive and well with COVID. At least they're not 12 or 14 in an hour. Now they're down to 2, maybe 1 or 2. The title of my paper is White Gaze, Black Skin, Binaries of Seeing and Being Seen. And in thinking while I was listening to my co-presenters, I thought how how one's sense of self is haunted by the problematics of being aware that you see yourself being seen. The problem with that is that if you are Black, you have to use the resources, the mental, psychic, and internal resources that you have available to you to manage on a daily basis all the potential risks that you can imagine may be waiting ahead for you. So danger, fear of being endangered is an everyday state, and there's no protection from it if you're Black. The everyday experiences of Black-skinned people in America are often seen as being far removed from what is considered psychoanalytic. The routine associations we make to seeing dark-skinned folk in our neighborhoods and also in the psychoanalytic situation often have pervasive and historicized links to our national traumas. When we see and hear Black people talk about their lives, defensive structures that we are trained to basically accept and see as normal, these defensive structures render them and their experiences difficult and nearly impossible to metabolize on any level, and certainly not to understand if you're in the clinical situation. The foundational cultural and social consciousnesses of everyday life that comes with living in the United States, where what it means to be Black is binary, imposed from the outside, psychically experienced from the inside, is arguably, to me, the last frontier in multicultural discourse that needs work. And it screams out, these times screams out for us to apply our minds to what it is like to be the embodiment of universal international Blackness. Taking a Fanonian perspective on the everyday lived experiences of Black people in America can move clinical theory closer to a more humane form of inclusiveness, especially if we begin the dialogue with a clear assumption that people of African descent have an unconscious, followed by a second assumption that the perception of human differences based on skin color is an internal psychic operation shared by all the people in this country and operates effectively in the dyad. In fact, the photogenic object as described by Fanon is a contemporary relational process. Fanon's articulation of the potency of the colonialist narrative of the essence of Blackness projected and superimposed on the Black body by the white gaze, combined with Cheryl Thompson's declaration that Blackness permeates all aspects of being, are overlooked theorizations of the way skin color operates in society. This aspect of interpersonal encounters is a shared experience by the looker and the looked at. Blackness looking and seeing whiteness looking and vice versa is a paralytic trauma that need not be repressed because of our denial of roots of racialization in this country. It is often very difficult and hard to examine. There is a shared internality of racial representations with a related sense of dissociative actions that can occur in the white gaze. And again, I emphasize that the white gaze is a shared binary phenomenon. The power of the white gaze lies in the privileges associated with its cultural authority to make judgments about others and have those judgments stick, sometimes resulting in the member of the racialized group being endangered. The white gaze seems to be participatory. The white gaze can be looked at binarily as white over black, black over white, and it can be understood within a projective, introjective matrix informed by developmentally overlearned experiences that all of us analysts know too well. The all-pervasive naturalized impact of the white gaze on the sensitivities of those with Black skin fosters a sense of constantly being under suspicion. It fosters a sense of hypervisibility while also being dislocated, feeling dislocated in the presence of others when outside of their natural or usual living environments. The looker and the seen share these processes, which are driven by the dynamics of each other's possession or lack of power. There is a bifocal aspect to this level of shared awareness of being seen, seeing the other. Recognizing aspects of the self in the other prompts socially sanctioned defensive maneuvers that color the interactions, and I use color in quotation marks. These shared and ineffective repressed awarenesses of each other are part of what makes white and Black encounters so dangerous. Resistance to seeing what is recognized in the other, particularly the Blackened other, is fraught with risk of self-awareness and identification. African American people in the United States are marked as Black by the socioeconomic status and situation of the poorest and most abject members of their externally defined cultural groups. In other words, regardless of your economic, social, or economic status, when you move in the world in the United States, you are perceived by all those around you as having the attributes of the least established of your group, those with the least amount of money, those who have the most stigma. This is what you can assume to be a naturalized state when you move outside in the world. African Americans are located on a multi-dimensional spectrum of Blackness that is co-constructed and that cannot be easily dissociated from class and ethnic markers. And I use ethnic markers deliberately here because in my borough, there are probably over 100 different languages spoken. I don't have a real measure of the absolute number of ethnic groups that are represented in my area, but it's way more than I would say any that you can find in any one borough the size of ours, any country the size of our borough. I'm going to read that sentence again. African Americans are located on a multidimensional spectrum of Blackness that is co-constructed and that cannot be easily dissociated from class and ethnic markers for poverty, abjection, and danger, and impulsive aggression. So African Americans are to be feared. The presence of Blackness in spaces that are deemed white or normal means that there's danger in that space. Americans who can locate themselves on the spectrum of whiteness can rely on a cultural position that has the privilege to dissociate from these same factors without risk of objection or the trauma that could come from being forced to recognize what we ordinarily locate on the skins of Black folk. In the natural scheme of things, when the white gaze is operating in the presence of Blackness, whiteness is the location of all that is privileged and desired. And that's my.
Thank you so much, Annie Lee. Such powerful talks across the board. Before we open it up to questions and answers, please, any questions you have, channel it into the Q&A section. We already have a couple there. Please feel free to ask. to the whole panel, to anybody to one person in the panel, and then of course the panelists themselves if they have questions. One of the things I started thinking about while you were speaking, Annie Lee, and I think Feluke also mentioned Fred Moten, was his idea about this sort of hypervisibility and visibility spectrum, right? And so I found the quote actually that I love him. He talks about the mark of invisibility, where he reminds us that it's a racial mark. Invisibility has visibility at its heart. To be invisible is to be seen instantly and fascinatingly recognized as the unrecognizable, as the abject, as the absence of individual self-consciousness, as a transparent vessel of meanings. So the movement, again, here's movement again, between visibility and visibility at once. And how I was thinking about this idea, what you were saying about the white gaze, and it's the white gaze that names, you know, how we're read when things become visible or not. The same racialized being, body, person can be both at once, right? Depending on the relationality. You talked about relationality with whiteness, with the white gaze, which reduces and expands as it sees fit, in service of its own coherence. And so what does that say about, again, our questions about how do we rework, how do we imagine a world where we're not inscribed within these structures, or that we continuously push up against these structures, create fissures in them, push up against them so that they crack in ways so that we can keep moving despite the pressures that are involved, I'm going to, do the panelists have questions for each other, or should I go to the Q&A? I see a couple questions here. I can turn to the first question, or Feluke, were you going to say something?
Okay.
I don't have a question. I'm just absorbing. I think I'm really affected and moved by what has been shared. So if I have questions, they're going to appear as we go along, I guess. So I'm happy for myself to take the questions from the participants.
Sure. Annie Lee, were you saying something?
For Luca, I recognize myself in the narrative you gave about being designated by where did you train, what clinic are you? So all of that is so desired and so important. If I am going to speak as a Black woman speaking, who's also a psychoanalyst. So I chafed a little bit when I heard my credentials, but then I thought about how those same credentials have given me access to be on this panel, and also access to be able to write more than writing some kind of assessment out in the world. So there's much there, but problematizing that is very important, because there are many voices that need to be heard to help us describe these experiences of women and people from different locations in the world. We have to write about these things, and the narrative format is what I really admire, and I appreciate your presentation very much.
Thank you. I mean, I just respond because somebody I wrote in the chat as well about that comment, and I suppose I want to put it in context. Access is really important, and I am so happy that Annie Jones is who you are, and you are in the places you are so that you can do the work you need to do. And I think I'm thinking of access. You know, we lived in West Africa for 10 years. And of course, access to the outside, as in outside of Africa, is a kind of prized thing. So people make a lot of moves to get visas if they can, because that's the preferable thing. So the visa system stinks. but the access is useful. Do you know what I'm trying to
Yes,
say?
I
Like,
do.
you know, it's this tension. It's like, it is the contradiction. I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't, you know, credentialize themselves. I think the problem comes when, and I'll go back to the visas as an illustration, when you get the visa and then you start to think that you have kind of made it. Do you know what I mean? Then you become a part of the problem, and you forget that this was about access. It's about how you can move now that you have this thing, rather than that you can settle as if, oh, okay, now I made it, you know. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yes.
And to me, that seems also the parallel to what Sohail was saying about these structures that would name who gets access to care and who doesn't, right? There's also a naming process, a sort of credentialing, if we will, right? Here, this is the type of immigrant I am. This is the type of migrant I am. I fit within these structures. Of course, again, the myth of safety. There's almost a sort of an inculcation into a language that's already violent, right? Setting you apart from those who won't be accepted. So in the case of Muslims, for example, right, having to declare and say, I am not of those bad Muslims. I am not a terrorist. All these sort of the language of violence that's inscribed by the imperial state to create these categories that will allow access or not, and that are arbitrary too. We know that you can do everything right and still be marked or read in a certain way. Let me look at the questions here we have. So we have a question from Nancy Hollander. Since psychoanalytic theories were born and nurtured within a Eurocentric context, what can be liberated and recontextualized from their assumptions of universality to be useful to peoples of color? Perhaps this is across the board to the panelists. Whoever wants to jump in.
I'll start.
Okay.
I'll just start with the reason I look at the object relational processes that are internal is that it moves me away from the old traditional thinking that has stagnated our work in the U.S. Also, the primitive, redefining the way those who are non-Europeans are seen, and still do that within a psychoanalytic frame. I like Celia Brickman's writing. Her writing is outstanding on this subject. And I also think that when I present as an embodiment of Blackness, when I'm presenting in a psychoanalytic space, I usually find a way to announce that Black Americans, Black people, and people who are considered non-white have an unconscious. And I do it with authority because I am credentialed. And I use that to basically develop what Philip Eubanks calls a licensing story. I smile about it because Philip Eubanks is an economist who I met at a psychoanalytic conference who told me that operation was a very valid operation to help redefine constructs that are traditional and that are embedded in theory. So I do it every chance I get because the shock, the trauma of a white analyst hearing me announce that Blacks have an unconscious is destabilizing. And I think someone mentioned that about moving the construct off of its bedding or off of its moors so that it can be viewed and seen and utilized in a different way. So that's what I do.
Yeah. I like the idea of using and seeing and in a different way. And what I think about with this, and I don't have an answer exactly, but what I think about is how theories are claimed, if you like. Is it all about a kind of an individual's thinking or a set of individuals' thinking that makes it European? Because actually, well, we've all always been here, living and breathing and moving, and in these really complex, you know, I don't want to use the word entanglements now, but we are completely enmeshed with each other. So is it really European in the way that it is completely useless? No, I don't think so. And I think if we were to, you know, trace some of it back, so, you know, did Freud and Jung, and did they all develop their theories in isolation? You know, no. And a lot of these ideas are, you know, exist in other places because they're claimed or written about or thought about. So I think about it in terms of erasure, really. If someone tells you, erases you and then tells you it's not your field, while you were working the field all the time, you've been working the field, I think that we can learn, because we are there, actually. And maybe part of our task is to really look again, keep looking. And I know I keep going on about Christina Sharp, but, you know, she kind of talks about this experience of a particular photo it was after the earthquake in Haiti, of looking at this particular photo, which was used by media to kind of show the Black life as disaster narrative, really. But if you keep looking and keep looking and keep looking, you maybe will see something that shows you life otherwise, shows you that that's not the full story, actually. And in the end, what she saw, that the child in the image had her hair kangarooed, and she had a feather stuck in it. And she said, after like 3 years of looking, what I saw is, oh, somebody braided her hair. So we're told a story about disaster, but actually there's care in there. There's another story also there alongside the obvious trauma. So I think of theory sometimes a bit like that. I'm not going to throw it out. I'm going to keep looking and being with.
In some ways, you're reminding me about seizing power, right? Seizing power of the narrative and the angle from which that narrative is told, and that these spaces, one of the things that these spaces, though they may have written us out of them, that they're not without our labor and our thoughts and our resource, which is precisely what Imperial Project does, right? And sort of like the British Empire is built on extraction of resource, that there wouldn't be a British Empire without the extraction and stealing of resources that does not come from there, but is now called Britain, right? Or the British Empire, what came to be. So how do you excavate a space within that and seize the power to be, even when it feels like maybe there isn't space for us? So hey, I know you wanted to also say something.
Yeah, so obviously I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I was thinking, yeah, in building on what was said previously, like what actually makes something European. You know, in research methodology, for instance, a lot of the things we talk about, like focus groups or something, is rooted in 1,000 different ancient cultures, and sort of the appropriation of knowledge and the renaming of knowledge is a colonial thing. So maybe it's right to sort of question how European are these ideas. But I was also thinking, and generally through this panel, are we in the wrong place? Like, are we practicing? It feels like these are, I don't know how to say it, the problems of we're practicing in places where we're minorities, we're diaspora, we're kind of, you know, if for instance, you know, I'm Iranian. If I was doing mental health in Iran, the issues I would face would be totally different. Like the issues we talked about today feel like they are issues of dislocation, issues of,
I see that.
yeah, just throwing that out there.
I can see that. One of the things about 3 months ago, a student asked me if I knew that many of the slaves that arrived on these shores wrote and knew Arabic. And it was an interesting question because I didn't know that. But also, when I listened to him carefully, he was leading up to deliver a nasty little diatribe to me about Muslims being on these shores forever since the country was discovered. So he opened up space for me to say to him, it's very interesting that you picked me to ask the question, a woman from Augusta, Georgia. I said, I wouldn't know Arabic if my life depended on it. And yet you asked me, I wonder why you didn't ask anyone else in this audience. So in that, the young man walked away. He was looking for a space to basically locate his hate, he was the embodiment of white racism and white power, and he had to ask me this question. And I did my research and I was delighted. He actually led me on a path that I never knew I would be on, that I'm actually looking at the origin of some of the first slaves that were brought to the Caribbean and to South Carolina. But the intent was something else. It was to rob me of my voice. It was to rob me of my comfort in being present in this absolute white space. And I say that to echo what you're saying, Sohail, in that I was in the wrong place. I was in the absolute wrong space to think about anything. And this question at the end of the meeting certainly sealed that for me. So there is something about location. And I think that's why I'm always feeling like I can't think when I go to speak psychoanalytically, because I feel endangered. Okay? And I think you're hitting something very, very important. What saves me is my clinical work when I'm in the room listening. And for that, I'm very thankful to the deep listeners and thinkers that I had as trainers. But outside of my office, it's a very different thing, especially in psychoanalytic spaces. I'm not in a good space, and I'm certainly dislocated.
Okay, did you want to say something to that?
Yeah, I was thinking about dislocation, what Sohail said, and these being problems of dislocation. And again, it reminded me that there was a time when I thought that that was it, that the problem is location and we need to move. You know, we were in London, had 5 small children. There were just lots of problems really with trying to raise these children here. And I thought the problem was location, and we left. And there are lots of good things about relocating, being in a location in which you are not having to, some of the things that Annie said about the white gaze, where those things don't apply in the same way. But I think over time I realized there are many different ways of being dislocated. And kind of the globalization of problems is such that some of that well, for me, I'm not going to say for any, it was a kind of romanticism. It was kind of an idea that there was a place where I could be well without effort, really, you know, where a kind of a home, if you like, or a belonging. But yeah, I realized, you know, all the problems that we have, they look one way here, they look another way there. There's still urbanization, still massive movements of people away from, you know, communities into urban spaces in which, you know, a lot of the problems that we see here start to appear. So, yeah, I don't know about, I guess my tendency is to see things are different, but they replicate. So they're different, but not that different. They have a slightly different flavor, I would say, rather than, yeah. I don't know if I'm making myself very clear, but anyway.
Yes, I understand. Yes.
And I think in that way, maybe we can see it within the lens of coloniality, which is not tethered to geographical space, right? Where even after colonialism proper, right, which does have geographical embodiment, then the coloniality, which speaks to a social, economic, relational pattern that would defy that movement and dislocation, and I agree with you, Fulike, that then dislocation follows you because you're under the parameters of that coloniality. Now, how salient that is and where it comes up, I think is important. Let me take another question here from Krish. Thank you for these very moving presentations that have answered many questions that I came here with. I'm now embarking on a doctoral course in psychology. We've just finished an intensive induction week, which was put together with so much love and well thought out activities. However, at the end of the week, I was left with a clinical sense of breathlessness. I tried to sit with this for the last few days. I've come to the conclusion that it is my own in that it feels overwhelming in that I'm so aware of my going to bring this issue of Western clinical practices on the Black, Asian, minority ethnics. I do not want to be the angry Black person who, quote, goes on about it, for this is the label I have now come to occupy. I'd like to be a joyful clinical militant and work with everyone. What do I do to bridge this, to also enjoy the love of the subject of psychology throughout this doctorate process?
Yeah, I wonder if anger can be also joyful if it doesn't get stuck, you know, if it doesn't, and if we don't take on this label of the angry as an individual, think you are angry, there's something wrong with that, you need to fix it, work it through, you know, whatever. Rather than, of course, there is anger, and maybe you are the one that it comes through in the room, and all to the good then, you know, that why would we not be? But actually, I think when I talked earlier, you know, about despair, we have to have antidotes. And, you know, I'm really purposeful about working the antidotes to despair, which is about joy. And the book I talked about, Joyful Militancy, actually gathering in ways that are joyful. Yes, we've got serious work to do, but actually, can we kind of have a good time when we're together? Can we be in community that actually feels good? Pleasure, you know, is pleasure, rest, joy, because anger can be, if it lives, you know, in community with all those things, then, you know, then it has a space. I think the problem comes when we're in those kind of learning spaces, and what happens is, I remember once when somebody said to me in a training group when I was, you know, young and training, you know what I wish for you? I wish you some joy in your life. And I felt so shamed. I can remember the feeling of, oh, I'm that angry. I'm the one who's carrying this terrible burden of just being miserable or angry or, but I realized, you know, now I can see that, oh no, you put me there. You want me to hold that energy so that you can be joyful and happy and whatever you can be. So, yeah, part of it is not buying the whole individual arrangements. No,
Yes.
no. If there's something in this room, it belongs to all of us.
Yes.
So I'm just bringing it. I'm going to say it or express it or whatever, and I'll have the joy too. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's why I am trying to conceptualize the white gaze as binary, because I think it's in all of us, and I think it's a shared phenomenon that's socially and culturally supported by the institutions and all the spaces that we move in. I just wish I had that. Well, I think I will have that on tape because I'm thinking about it. So, yes, you captured it very well. I think, yes.
I think also that's how I imagine this space to be, is one of many spaces in which we find each other too, right? Again, the sort of connection across disembodied space, and that this feels so nourishing. I'm a person of color, an immigrant in the United States, an Arab woman post 9/11. And during graduate school, it did not feel like this, right? I was searching at, grasping at straws, like anybody that can sort of contain this process and to reflect back to me my sanity about the communal, what was missing in the communal. And that's my story of dislocation, is moving to a space where the racial codes switched so quickly, where I was already categorized, right? I existed before I even got there in people's fantasies. And so forging spaces, and I think this is what we're hoping to do with the mental health workers inquiry, but also the way this came to be, you know, amongst us, Sohail being a friend of Susanna's, I had seen Fuluke speak and was immediately drawn to her, reached out to her, Annie Lee Jones as a sister in my own spaces, and that this is how it comes to be, so that we're not constantly in spaces that are not of us or for us, that we're creating and speaking to the processes that we've all been through, and to reflect back to those who might be starting where we once were, to say there is a space for you, and that you know, we're forging these spaces together, and that we hope you will join us in doing so, and in owning that righteous anger to do that. That for me, that's what allowed me to stay within these spaces and to push forward, again, sort of pushing up against those fissures. And that's how I found my sisters and my brothers and all my siblings in this. Let me turn to another question. We have about 12 minutes left, so I want to try and get at what we can. This is from an anonymous attendee, so I'm sorry I can't say your name. When we talk about how we perceive the immigrant and their trauma from a westernized perspective and theoretical understanding, how then would the situation play out when it's an immigrant working with another in a clinical space? Would shared experience help, or would the larger imperialist discourse and theory they are located in still be a barrier?
Maybe I can address this from some people I've been speaking to in my research. Would shared experience help? Sometimes I feel like shared experience is presumed by nationality, but it doesn't actually exist. So people, you know, an Iranian therapist here might have been here for 20 years and might have trained here, and their understanding, their conceptions of mental health, I don't know if colonize is the right word, but it's very different. I guess maybe it's hard to arrive at a position of shared experience in a clinical setting, given the hoops and hurdles you have to go through to be a clinician. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts, at least.
And I want to add the in the clinical situation, when you have the therapist and the patient, or the analyst and the analyst's on, you always have this imbalance of power, and especially if the treatment is being conducted in an institution or in any kind of organized agency that basically requires reports, requires documentation of attendance, all these other kinds of things, then the nature of the relationship is affected. So that being said, I think the uniqueness of each individual in the dyad is what's most important, and structuring the space so that each can feel that they're being heard and experienced in their own individuality. I think that would be key, what I take from it all.
Yeah. What I was thinking then was how, yeah, Annie talked about individuality, and Suhail was talking about these different experiences of people who might be described in some way as immigrants. But the massive space that the word immigrant is attempting to cover here, which is the problem of language that I'm talking about. So actually, with these two examples that Suhail gave, it's a meaning, it's like, it's a word that means everything and absolutely nothing. So what does it really mean if an immigrant is working with another immigrant? And you know, yeah, so it speaks to that problem of language and how we describe people and experience, and how our tendency, again, back to fixedness, is we want to fix a thing. That's an immigrant. Now we know what we're dealing with. We know what to do. No, that's a person with, you know, a whole raft of experiences overlapping with another person with a whole raft of similar and different experiences. But I think it's this, well, it's a very othering word, actually, isn't it? You know, I liked somebody put in the comments, actually, I think it might have been Robert, my friend, about the sanctuary seeking, Suhail's word. That actually it does something when we think of, when we use different words, sanctuary seeking.
That's right. Let's take another question. This is from Kasera, and shout out to Kasera, who's wonderful. Regarding the question of, are we practicing in the wrong place, feeling endangered? I've always been interested in analytic training, but wrestle with the very colonialist nature of these institutions. I've been very traumatized in analytic spaces as a Black woman and had to take some time away from those spaces, and have found it very difficult to motivate, to reintegrate into something that feels it is essentially a system that is designed to re-traumatize people who look like me and are teaching in a way that knowledge is passed on to us, that is designed also to traumatize our clients and reinforce that fixedness. I'm not sure how to reconcile this, but maybe what is being spoken to is that it cannot be. How do I continue to move and not burn out under the threat that exists in these spaces? And how do other Black, Indigenous people of color do so?
I mean, I think it's a really important question, this. And I think it speaks to crossing. To me, one of the ways I survived was because I was always crossing. It's like I always had anchors elsewhere, elsewhere and otherwise, because I think it can be really intensive. Training is a really intensive, immersive. You can feel like it's the whole world, the people that you're with and these ideas. And you know, it's people to keep you grounded. You know, it's the people, and back to the forging spaces that you talked about, Lara, really, you know, making sure you hold on to the spaces that are nothing to do, and this is just me personally telling you this, that are nothing to do with the space that you're training in. But they don't move like that. They have a different way of moving. that actually reflects your moving. So then you can, sometimes you have to be a bit like on the down low, don't you? You can challenge and bring your own ideas, but sometimes you have to be quiet just for your own peace of mind, for your own well-being. So you kind of, we do think, I think, temper our moving in these kind of academic training spaces, which is why I think it's about balance, having other spaces that, yeah, different kinds of moving.
That's very wonderful. I would say the beauty of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic work with an analyst that's a good fit, it's that it's the road to freedom. Freedom to think clearly even when you feel in danger. Freedom to wonder about things that you could only whisper about outside of your session. There's a beauty in it, that intimate relationship that you carry over time with someone that you highly respect and you would like to be like, and who feels the same about you. I think that's the work. I've said that many, many times, that being able to, when I see a young Black man being stopped by police and manhandled, I always say, oh, if only he had a space where he could think about himself, inside of himself, while he's being presented with such nasty business on the street. And what I'm referencing often is the young Black male or the young adolescent in therapy with his good enough analyst. So I really believe in the work, and I think there's power to it. That's why I think the process has been around so long. And discovering the capacity to dream and to work through any and everything internally without having to respond so much to all that's coming from the outside of you. So that's what I think, why doing the training is important and why the work is important.
I would add, for me also, is sort of the working through of, again, how militancy is also inscribed, and the ways in which, how do we understand ourselves in these spaces, and that there's strategy, and then there's also giving ourselves permission not to exist in these spaces, right? Not to be there and not to lend ourselves in this way, and to that creates a different type of militancy, but that doesn't also mean that we don't necessarily have access, right? And so when we start to sort of seek access in the very restrictive ways that it's telling us that's how access is gotten, or that's how knowledge is produced, right? Only within these walls, only within this way, only within this, with this credential. And then if we choose to go down that route, as I have, right? I've chosen to do that. I have not chosen to get analytic training for the very reasons that Sarah's saying, and I'm comfortable with that. But if you choose to do so, what are the strategies within that? When do we push? When do we not push? When do, how do we subvert from within? Right? How every space we take up is one of potential subversion, and what does that look like? So they're bigger questions also of who defines what that looks like. We are winding down. I just want to thank you to everybody who has asked questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I want to open it up to our panelists. Any final words you have, or anything you want to say that's still hanging?
I want to say I was very moved when Elise started talking about what it is to be in Queens right now as a Black woman and the danger of that. And somebody else spoke about breathlessness, and I'm thinking about how we are breathing for those who can't breathe anymore. You know,
Yes.
that our every breath is precious, and so I just want to kind of thank you all really for breathing with me, co-conspirators, and yeah, wish you more breath. Really, thank you. And to everybody who I can't see, who's there in the chat, offering the love and the thought. Appreciated.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. Yes.
Thank you so much, Emily. So, hey, any last words?
Yeah, just really thank you. It's almost 11 o'clock here, and I'm still super engaged, and it's been a really beautiful discussion. I've been taking notes and quoting what you guys have been saying. It's been really beautiful, and I'll read through it and feel warm inside afterwards.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who tuned in. This will be sent out as a recording. You can find us on Twitter, on YouTube, and feel free to reach out to us. I put my email as well. This is how communal building starts, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, so much. Have a great day, night, wherever you are in the world. Bye.
Bye-bye.